My name is Nelson Smith, and I'm doing this interview because I did 6 years in the Licking County Jail back in the early 60s. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because my mother was hired as the matron and head cook at the county jail. She was hired by Sheriff Bill McElroy. He was one of the sheriffs, if you've looked at the history, that had a heart attack and died in the jail while he was on duty. But before that happened, he evidently found out that my mother was in need of a job. She had my sister and I at home, and he offered her the full-time position as matron and head cook, and he came down to our house, and when he offered her the job and did her job interview, he did something that I've never seen anybody in a job interview do before. He invited my little sister and I to sit in on mom's job interview. And keep in mind, I was 12 or 13 and my sister was 11. So we sat in on a job interview, and he went through all of her duties that she would be responsible for. But one of the things that he told us was, along with the job came a residence at the county jail. We would get the whole top floor apartment in the front of the residential section of the jail. So after he went through the whole interview with Mom and explained all of her duties, he turned to Kathy and I and asked us if we had any questions. And I looked him right square in the eye and I said, "I've only got one." I says, "Will we be able to do anything at the jail that we could do any place else we live?" And he never hesitated. He said, "Without a doubt, this is going to be your home. You can do anything in the jail that you do wherever you live." And he never went back on that word. And no sheriff following him ever restricted us in any way. He said, "I would like you to keep a little security in mind, and that'd be your only restriction." So with that, I smiled at Mom. I knew she would appreciate the job, full-time, a home. We didn't care where the home was, and I thought it'd be cool to live in the jail. So we weren't going to discourage her. We kind of gave her the nod, and she accepted the job, and we moved in. So I spent, like I say, about 6 years from the time I was in junior high school through high school, and just before I joined the Navy. I was running in and out of the jail like I owned the place. And our entrance into the jail to get into our apartment wasn't through the front residential section. We came in through the north gate, the big iron bar jail doors on the side, right past what was then the desk sergeant's office, or the control sergeant's office, and into the cell block area. We could either take the elevator up to our apartment or simply run up the steps past all the cell blocks and right to the apartment door that was adjacent to the women's cell block on the 4th floor in the back section. And that was, of course, Mom's jurisdiction on the women's cell block. Just a little description of our apartment when we lived there. It was 2 bedrooms, a living room that was kind of in between the Mom's bedroom and the kitchen area. And then my bedroom was the south room in the front of the jail. Had a nice roundy contour to the south end. I thought it was bigger then, but when I walk in it now, it seemed awfully small. But I had a great view of the south end of Newark, and one of the views that I like to remember was a billboard that was always, and there's still a billboard there now, right next to what we call the subway. I guess it's the underpass on 3rd Street, but we called them subways in the south end. But this billboard was from Walker and Batat Ford, and it had a new Mustang on it for 1995. So that was my view for almost a year, looking out, kind of dreaming about having that Mustang. So with that in mind, our door to our apartment was 15 feet away from a cell block. So one of my early stories about living there involved Mom's first lockup. She wasn't a big woman, so I was a little worried about her being able to handle the position of locking up people in jail. And to that end, the first time she ever had to lock one up when I was there was in the middle of the night. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and we had a direct line from the desk sergeant's console up to our apartment. And the phone rang one night, like I say, it was about 2 o'clock, and they told Mom she had a lockup to do. Of course, the phone woke me when it rang, and I kind of thought I was the man of the house at 12 or 13 years old, so it was my job to protect her. So when she went out to wait for the elevator coming up, there used to be an elevator in the jail, by the way. She was waiting for the elevator to come up, and you could hear the prisoner, and she was coming up with 2 city cops. And you could hear her smacking these cops, slugging these cops, swearing. I mean, just nasty. And you knew it was her hitting them, not the other way around. So I was really concerned at this point, and I stood at the door and cracked it just a little bit so I could keep an eye on her and make sure I was ready to jump if she needed me. I didn't care if there were 2 city cops there. I was the one that was supposed to take care of her. But anyway, she's swearing and swinging at these cops, and the elevator door opens, and she comes out with her fist back toward Mom, and my mom grabbed her by the wrist and put her on her knees. And she said, "Lady, if you ever hit me, they'll carry you out of here." I quit worrying about my mommy taking care of herself, and I quit talking back to her. When I mentioned Sheriff McElroy promising that we could do anything in the jail that we'd do any place else we lived, one of the times that I pushed him on that promise, I wanted to have a party. I had a buddy in the 9th grade that actually Sheriff McElroy was gone by this time, but I think it was maybe Bernie Howarth. But like I say, they all kept that promise. They allowed us to have the party. It was a going away surprise party for a junior high student. We had about 40 junior high kids down in the chapel to surprise him for the party. And we were supposed to stay in the chapel, but once all the kids realized it was an elevator and it went right past all the cell blocks, we were kind of running the elevator a little bit and yelling in the cell blocks, and the young guys kind of like teasing the women on the 4th floor, but we didn't let that get out of hand. So anyway, that was the first party we had, and I know it was Sheriff Howarth that allowed me to have a poker game one night in the apartment. I worked at the Newark Advocate, which at that time was just kind of across the parking lot to the building, and I had 5 or 6 guys come over, and I wanted to let the sheriff know ahead of time what was going on. So I told him, I said, "Bernie, we're having a poker game in the apartment tonight. Just want to let you know." And his first reaction was, "There won't be any money on the table, will there?" "Oh, no, sir. No, that won't be." And he says, "There won't be any beer, will there?" I said, "Oh, no, most of them are underage. A couple of them are legal, but most of them are underage, so that won't be a problem either." And I said, "By the way, Sheriff, the kitchen door won't be locked." And he kind of smiled at me and kind of got my gist that he knew what I was asking without saying anything. So about an hour into the poker game, by the way, Sheriff Howarth was very tall, very distinguished looking, and he looked very empowering in his sheriff's uniform. So we're sitting in a poker game, kitchen door bursts open, and there's this big uniformed sheriff standing in the hallway or in the doorway, and he looked at the whole crew and said, "Don't anybody touch anything on that table. Don't anybody move. I want all your names, your parents' phone numbers. We're calling them right now." And he went around the room and he got about 3 of them written down, and I couldn't take it any longer. I bust out laughing. And we didn't have the word punk back then, but these guys had just gotten punked by the Licking County Sheriff. So that was quite a night for him. When I turned 16, and I was living in the jail, I didn't have a car yet, but I had a Honda 50. It was a little Honda scooter, chance to get around town. And I came, we didn't have curfews back then either. So I came home late one night, and I was only 16 years old, and it was after midnight. And I pulled up to the square coming in off of West Main Street, and it was a red light. And I sat there and I looked around, and this was before you're allowed to turn right on red. And I looked around and there wasn't a car in sight, and it was 2 in the morning, and I ran the red light. Down 3rd Street I went, pulled in behind the old jail, and back then we had a garage where there's a grassy area now behind the jail. So I pulled in and parked my Honda, and when I walked out there was a city cop sitting blocking the garage. And he didn't know who I was, didn't know that I lived there. And I walked out and looked at him and I said, can I help you? He says, yeah, what are you doing here? I said, I live here. He says, come on, what are you doing? I says, I just put my bike away, I live here. And he was kind of doubtful, wasn't believing me. And I said, is there a problem? And he said, yeah, you ran a red light on the square. I said, come on. I said, 2 o'clock in the morning. I said, there wasn't any traffic. I said, I didn't see you. And he says, obviously. So I says, well, I'll tell you what. If we go into the jail and Jack tells you, Jack was Jack Jones, the desk sergeant. He said, if Jack confirms that I live here, we forget about a ticket. He still thought it was just giving him a line. So we walked in, and I didn't even say anything to Jack other than, hey, Jack, can I have the key? And the key opened what I called was a cage that was a barrier that separated the foyer to the cell block area. So I said, Jack, can I get the key? And he says, yeah, go ahead, Nell. So I walked in, got the key off the desk, and went out and unlocked the cage, and turned around and looked at this cop, and I says, do me a favor and lock this back up and give Jack the key. And I did say, please. And I just turned around, walked up the steps into the jail, and he just stood there. And I didn't look back, but I knew he was standing there looking at me like, what just happened? So Jack kind of explained to him that, yeah, I live here. So when I'm telling this story about the construction of the jail, it was a little different when we lived there. When you walk in that north gate, it was an open foyer that went all the way up to the 4th floor. Now there's individual rooms on each floor, so you walk in and it's just a room. And there was also what I called the cage, was a wire mesh screen that had a wire door on it, mesh door. And anytime I came in at night, I had to have that unlocked so that I could get past the cell block area, or into the cell block area. And then above that floor, on each of the floors of the way up, there were just bars. So when I finish this little tale with my favorite story, you have to keep in mind that construction that's different now if you go into the jail. One of my little stories about running around town, a little later, I guess I was 17 or 18, and I finally had a car, and oh, it was beautiful. It was a 63 Ford Galaxy 500 convertible. So it was pretty rare in town and fairly well known by the deputies that it was mine. And I had a date one night, and I'd never told this girl, it was our first date, I'd never told her that I lived at the county jail. Didn't like to spring that on them too early. So we were coming in what was called the expressway then, the new highway coming into Newark, Route 16, and I was speeding just a little bit. And I looked up in my mirror, and there was a county deputy coming in behind me with his lights on and flashing a little siren once in a while. And I turned to the girl and I said, oh God, I can't get another speeding ticket, I'm gonna have to run him. And I punched it, and we're flying in the expressway, and he's right on my tail with the lights and sirens. And we got to the 21st Street exit, and he was right beside me, and I looked over at him, and he was smiling at me. And I realized that, you know, it was going to be cool. So right at the 21st Street exit, he was right here, and I peeled off the exit, and he just went on into town. And the girl, I never told her I lived at the jail after that. I thought that was so cool that I got away with that. So anyway, a lot of times when I talk about living at the jail, the question will come up about, were there any prisoners that I got to know? And 2 come to mind. One of them was on was in a cell on the 3rd floor. Now the 1st and 2nd floor of the jail were men's cell blocks. The cell block itself was always locked down. There was no real access to it. The 3rd floor, some of the cells were locked down, but the cell block itself was open. Trustees had cells in the 3rd floor, so they kind of came and went without being locked down. And there were a couple of prisoners on the 3rd floor that were in their cells and didn't have access to roam the cell block. And one of these was an attorney from New York who had been in an accident. He was charged with driving under the influence. Back then, I think we just called it drunk driving. And unfortunately, his wife died in the accident, and he was charged with manslaughter. And he did his time in the county jail after the sentence. And since I had access to the 3rd floor when I went past it all the time, I knew he was in there, and I was kind of interested in the law, and I had at that point been thinking about going to law school. So I thought it would be interesting, and I went in and started a conversation, and it turned out to be a kind of a regular thing. I'd visit with him all the time, and he taught me how to play gin rummy through his cell bars on that 3rd floor location. My favorite prisoner, I usually tell both names, but if I'm going to put it on the record, I'm just going to call him Buck. That was his first name. There was a story, and I never asked him about it. It's just what I'd always heard, that in the 50s, at some point, he was arrested downtown Newark for being intoxicated in public. And he tried to tell the cop that that's not true. I'm not drunk. I'm on medication, and that's what makes me kind of wobble a little bit when I walk. Well, the cop didn't believe him, and he had to go to court. Well, he tried to tell the judge the same story, and of course the judge wasn't buying it either. And he was about to pass sentence on Buck, and Buck interrupted him before he made his final comments, and he said, "Your Honor, if you send me to jail, the county will support me for the rest of my life." He gave him 30 days, and Buck never left that jail for more than 2 or 3 the rest of his life. He was in and out of the jail so often and for such lengthy times, they made him a trustee. He'd do 30, 60 days for being drunk in public. At this point, he went out and got drunk every time he got out, or found some reason to be arrested, and back in jail he'd come. But he never spent more than 2 or 3 days free. He was always back. So as a trustee, he kind of had the freedom to roam the building, do a little outside maintenance, work on the inside of the building, the outside of the building. But he was also an assistant for my mom. He would help Mom do the cooking in the kitchen. And he called her Mom. Of course, all the deputies, all the prisoners, they all called her Mom. And she was a pretty good cook. So she didn't just do bologna sandwiches and for meals, or she wouldn't just do cereal for breakfast. She cooked home-cooked food for the prisoners, and it was always very surprising that during mealtime there was a lot of traffic from the deputies just happened to have to stop back by the jail. So she fed deputies, she fed prisoners, even to the point that the grand jury, when they were in session, the judges would send the grand jury group down to the jail to be fed by Mom. And like I say, she was a pretty good cook. Everybody loved it. And Buck was locked up one time, 30 or 60 days, I don't know. And the deputy came up to a cell on the 3rd floor one Thursday morning and kind of kicked his bunk and said, "Buck, it's time to go." And he was just kind of waking up. He finally realizes, "Whoa, what do you mean it's time to go?" He says, "Your 60 days are up. You're out of here." And he thought, he says, "Oh, no, I can't go today. This is Thanksgiving. Mom's fixing turkey." And he says, "Sorry, that's the end of your sentence. You're out of here." So Buck walked out that north gate, the one that has the big steel bars on it, right next to what's the farm market now. Walked out that north gate and down to the end of the alley toward 2nd Street, where there was an old business called Don F's Bakery. Had big plate glass windows. And he found a rock, threw it through that window, and sat and waited for the cops. He was home for Mom's Thanksgiving dinner. One of the not so interesting stories, but a little bit of a tragedy downtown. there was a printing shop across the street from the jail. I think it was called North Leader, their original location. And it caught fire one night. And it was in the middle of winter, and the fire department was all out spraying water on it, and it was blowing back in their face, and it was freezing on their uniforms and or their equipment. And I was sitting in the top floor of the jail just kind of watching, and I hollered at Mom, and I said, Mom, these guys are freezing out there. She didn't even hesitate. She went down the kitchen and got the coffee pot brewing and was making coffee, and so I was shuttling coffee back and forth to the firemen as they were fighting this fire, and she just thought that was what she ought to do. So that was just one of the little extra things that she liked to keep an eye on everybody. One thing that I forgot to mention about my prisoner buddy, Buck. He was just a nice old guy. He may have had a drinking problem after he was in and out, but he was very helpful to Mom at the jail. And when I entered the soapbox derby, I built my soapbox derby in the basement of the jail, which was right outside the drunk tank. When you go into the basement, they highlight the section just to the left as the drunk tank. And I remember right there in the middle of the floor is where we built it. And one thing that I did after it was all done, and I painted it, it was a real royal blue paint job. And I got all done, and I cleaned out my brushes, and I didn't know what to do with the waste to throw away. I didn't want to pour it down a drain. I didn't know if I'd clog a drain. So I went up to my bedroom, and I had this can of turpentine or whatever we used to clean out the brushes that was basically blue because it was filled with paint too. And I decided just throw it out the window. And I figured it would disperse in the air and it'd hit the grass and no big deal. I threw it out the window and it was wind blowing back toward the building. And for about 5 years, there was this big blue streak right down beneath my bedroom window. Nobody ever asked about it. Nobody ever complained about it, but it was there for a long time. So I kind of got away with that too. I guess I'll conclude with, I probably forgot half my stories, but I'll conclude with my favorite story. If you were listening to any of the early part of the video, I explained the difference in the construction of the jail when I lived there, walking in through the north gate to what was a foyer all the way up to the top floor. Well, and then the cage on the first floor that was always locked that separated the offices and the cell block area. Well, I would come in late at night, and Jack Jones, the desk sergeant, the only one I remember, would be asleep at the console. So obviously it was after midnight, but he'd be asleep because shift change was at 11. And he'd sit back in his chair, and he'd always have a cigar in his mouth and ashes down the front of his uniform. And I'd have to wake him to let me in. And he'd grumble and mumble and get the key and go out and unlock the cage, and up the steps I'd run. And after doing that several times, I felt bad about waking him. So I thought, well, I know where the key is. So I just very quietly go in, take the key off the desk, and go out and unlock the cage, take the key back, and then pull the cage shut. Up the steps I'd go. About the third time I did that, I realized I'd just broken my promise to Sheriff McElroy that we would honor a little bit of security living in the jail. I was pulling the cage shut, but it didn't latch. It was unlocked at that time, so there was access for anybody to come off the street and into the cell block area. So I decided that's not a good idea. So after that, I'd come in late at night if Jack was asleep. I was 12, 13, 14 years old. Up the cage and over the bars I'd go. When you got to the top floor, there was a space about that big that had a nice wood rail on it, and I could just climb up all those bars and over the top. Well, I never got caught. I'll bet I did that for probably the last 4 years that I lived there. And I never worried about a county deputy catching me. But if a city cop came in and didn't know who I was and saw me on the bars, he's thinking I'm coming out. Well, I'm going in. So, but it was fairly easy to do, and I just did it as a regular way of getting in. But I came home one night, Jack was asleep. Over the bars I went, got into the apartment, and Mom wasn't home. And I had an old firecracker called an M80. It was about that long, about that big around, and it was basically just a little stick of dynamite, had a side wick on it. And I went to Mom's bedroom window, which was 2 floors, right directly above the desk sergeant's window. And back then, where the farm market is, there used to be a big, long building, so it was kind of close proximity in there. And I went to Mom's bedroom window and opened it, and I lit that M80, and I held it till the fuse got down way too far, and I finally dropped it. Well, it didn't even have time to hit the ground. It went off right beside Jack's window, and I giggled and went to bed. And about 5 minutes later, I started hearing sirens downtown. I said, oh God, there must be a fire. And then I started hearing more sirens, and I decided to get up and look out the window and see what was going on. And there wasn't a fire downtown. Every city cop, every county deputy, and a couple of state troopers had surrounded the jail, all lights and sirens gone. So I went to the phone, I called down and asked Jack, I said, Jack, what the hell's going on? He said, Nelson, stay in the apartment, a prisoner's got a gun. And I never told him any different. I never admitted the truth. I never told Mom. I think I finally admitted to that I'd done that. 2 sheriffs later, I told Sheriff Max Marston that had been me that pulled that little prank years ago. But it ended up all night long. They woke up every prisoner, searched every cell, and they were there till breakfast checking to see who had the gun. And I was kind of mum at the time. And I think that pretty much covers a lot of them.